This is Let's Talk with Hart Hagen, and I'm joined by Jake Bush. Jake, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. The COVID boredom is definitely kicking in, but I'm here. So
Uh-huh.
small victories.
Sounds good. So this has been a beautiful day. I was telling you before we started that it's one of the few days that I've been able to sit outside and almost all day. It's not too hot or too cold, and I've been getting some work done out there and enjoying the. We have some like native plants and butterflies and things like that, and it's nice to see those. It's nice to see nature at work. So tell me, tell me about the kitty cat.
Well, this is Remus, who is apparently now our co-host. Hi, buddy. Once it gets to this time of day, he starts thinking it's time to get fed, and he will remind me at all costs.
Right. Let's keep our priorities straight here, owner.
Exactly. The priorities is that he has to be full, and I have to serve his needs.
Yeah. Right. That's the priority. So I'm going to see if I can get to. Today we're talking about a book by Christopher Ketchum called This Land: How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West. Here's a little review of the book, or a blurb. It says, in the thoughtful but rowdy tradition of Edward Abbey, Ketchum offers us a revolutionary picture of the public lands as perhaps our last hope in a warming world steeped in the politics of despair. I would challenge anyone to read this inspiring book and not be stirred to fight for this land. So I have a quick list of things that this book is about. When I think of this, this book has rocked my world, and it's literally one of the best books I've encountered this year. And I do a lot of audiobooks, and this is one of the very best. The reader, I mean, Christopher Ketchum, the author, reads it himself. And I like saying that most authors do not read their own audiobooks, and those who do shouldn't.
Right.
There are a very few exceptions to that. And Christopher Ketchum is one important exception. Another one is Thomas Frank reads his own book, Listen Liberal, and does a masterful job of it. So this is Christopher Ketchum. And so when I think about This Land by Christopher Ketchum, it's about the American West. It's about myth versus reality. It's about the cowboy myth, how mythical and fake and misleading and false and fraudulent. What?
I'm rolling up my sleeves for that time.
Yeah, Jake is ready to talk about the cowboy myth.
Absolutely.
And we're going to do this. It's about cattle ranchers. It's about the industry that rapes our public lands, industries that rape our public lands. It's about the Endangered Species Act. It's about grizzly bears and mountain lions and wolves and prairie sage and prairie grouse. It's about animal cruelty at taxpayer expense. Public employees who are unspeakably cruel to animals because that's who they are, and we're paying for their sorry asses. It's about invasive species, not least of all, Bos taurus, the cow, is an invasive species in the American West that decimates ecosystems. And it's about ecosystems, and it's also about externalities, which is theft. I'm going to talk a little bit about externalities, and then I want you to lead us off in a discussion about cowboys and the fraudulent myth of the American cowboy. But externalities is like the study of economics, and there's no, so externalities are a term of art in economics. Externality means an exception to the rule. It means we have all these handy dandy formulas and algebraic equations, and but an externality is something that doesn't fit our little equations, or it does, but we choose not to measure it. In economics, we're only going to talk about what happens within the firm. In other words, if Nike makes shoes, Nike's purpose is to make a profit. The shifting the cost of making shoes onto the public is not our concern, because the only thing that microeconomics talks about is the costs that are internal to the firm. Or in this case, cattle ranchers, we're only concerned about the cost of raising cows and the revenue that you get from selling cows. And if the revenue from selling cows is more than the cost of raising cows, then that's the profit that I get to keep. Never mind the fact that the public has to pay for the cost of raising cows. Don't get me started.
Well, it's always funny, and I'm glad you mentioned that this is like a term of use in economics, and something that you hear a lot in economics. Is like, oh, the externalities, the externalities. Almost every time I have read about somebody talking about externalities, it's when some theorist will be like, well, there was this externality that totally screwed our theory up, and it's something simple. It's like, yeah, you should know that's going to happen.
Yeah, right.
Not
right.
in your little like Candyland theory world of all these supply side economics, like the Reagan.
Or it's a market failure.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Like markets are supposed to do anything but, like markets, when markets are successful, they make all your dreams come true. And then there's this little, oops, market failure, like the downturn of 2008. Or like climate change is a market failure. Oops, sorry. Markets failed in that little isolated instance, except markets usually fail.
Right.
If you look at the cost of externalities, they're not only more than the profits of a firm, they're more than the revenues of a firm. If you look at the externalities of the arms industry, the externalities created by the arms industry, properly valued, exceed all of the revenues of the arms industry. If you look at agribusiness, the costs, the externalities associated with agribusiness exceed their revenues. And this is, I'm not an economist and I don't have specific figures for this, but any idiot can, if you look at the true cost of agribusiness, then you know that it exceeds all of their revenues combined. And yet the shareholders of those corporations get to keep the revenues minus the profits, and we get the cost.
Yep. And of course they always say that, well, public health, climate change, the destruction of local fauna, all of that is an external to our theory, right? Mm-hmm. That's if you break down the language, that's what they're saying.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It has nothing to do with those things. Those are outside of our business.
Those are not our concern.
Just absolutely insane to think about. If you're like a rational human being who's not on the take, you're going to see through that immediately.
It'll make your head explode.
Yes.
Unless you have the benefit of a good education. Like Chomsky says, you have to have a good education to not see that there's a little problem here.
You're on a roll today, man.
Oh, well, we'll see if that's a problem or not.
I don't know.
Talk to us about Cowboys. So we're talking about the book This Land by Christopher Ketchum, and big part of the book is cowboy, the myth of the cowboy. So what's the problem? The myth of the cowboy. What could be wrong? Strong, virile, independent. What's the problem?
Well, the problem is that probably did not exist, at least in the way that it's formulated, right? So like, I grew up on John Wayne movies.
Mm-hmm.
That was always on in my house. I think I have seen The Sons of Katie Elder about 17 million times in my short life. And I will probably see it again because I can't get it out of my head that I enjoy those movies, frankly.
This town ain't big enough for the two of us.
Yeah, see? How could you not enjoy a good movie character? But
or Clint Eastwood. Go ahead, make my day.
Yes, see, that's fun. It's
right.
It's, action-packed and all that stuff. But ultimately, it is intentional myth-making. This is marketing, pure and simple. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I first got into college, I went to a community college to start off, and my history professor took some time in class to go over the cowboy, right? that he wanted specifically to talk about the cowboy for like half of an entire class, and these are like 2.5 hour class sessions. And what he wanted us to know was that everything we learned about the cowboy was BS. It was
Mm-hmm.
not real,
Mm-hmm.
right? He said most cowboys were either Mexicans or black guys, and a lot of them were on the frontier because they were pushed to the frontier. And yeah, they worked to drive cattle because that was a major part of our economy. But they were not just like the Lone Ranger wandering
People
around.
looked upon them the way people tend to look on the immigrant guy mowing your lawn.
Exactly.
You know, you don't want to be that in the mind of, in the popular white dominant imagination. And who changed that myth? None other than Theodore Roosevelt.
Precisely. Right. And now the reason for that is because around that time, America was starting to turn toward a sort of quasi-imperial sort of state, right? Under Roosevelt, we didn't really take on that mantle until like the Cold War in earnest, but like we were really turning in that direction, especially toward places like, I don't know, Hawaii or places in Latin America where we were starting to try to conquer and stick our hands into their business. But the reason is because Americans have always been fed a diet of myth.
The reason of what?
The reason that cowboys became compatible with that image
Mm-hmm.
was because we were trying to assert a national identity of conquering an untamed land,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the cowboy was a very easy aesthetic to force upon people, right? Through this sort of myth making and marketing.
Well, let's read a quote from the book, and then I'll let you continue.
Oh, yeah, please do.
Okay, the cowboy hero, this is from This Land by Christopher Ketchum. The cowboy hero has always been a commodity, a mythic construct of America's past, the product of a superior act of marketing. During the last quarter of the 19th century, the cowboy hero was manufactured and sold to the American public in a manner similar to that employed in the manufacture and sale of any other product of the Industrial Revolution. He resulted from the efforts of men working in the American entrepreneur, he resulted from the efforts of men working in the best American entrepreneurial tradition of making something from nothing.
Right. And the key word here, what it all hinges on, right, is nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Something from nothing.
Nothing. Right. So let's think about that right there. What message is that giving? Right. Because all that's true. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like we really have stuck with this sort of revisionism that says that Americans were the people who conquered an untamed land, and we put down the savages, right, the natives that lived here before us, and really brought this earth in this land to be at its best, right? We pulled all the resources from the earth in ways that nobody before us has been able to do, right? As if that were something desirable, as if that were sustainable, as if that were feasible. And the cowboy is a really, really good stand-in because you can have this image of an individual, right? That's another key.
Yeah.
Is that they're always an individual, just one person with their grit and their determination and their guts, putting their hands on the land and the people who occupy it and putting it into line, right? And bringing it into the light of industry and capitalism and exploitation.
It's an ethic that says, I'm going to dominate you, but you have to leave me alone.
Yes. It's
all this individualism, except when I want to tell you what to do.
Yes, exactly. And building up this sort of castles in the wilderness, as they probably view it, right? Of like, we're going to live on these massive farms that we over leverage. By that, I mean, we're just over leveraging the land and totally exploiting the land until it's no longer usable. And we're going to build a sort of small kingdom out in the wilderness, right? And all of these are very loaded statements.
Unlimited resources, wide open spaces.
Right.
Take what you want. It's there for the taking.
Right. And it's this sort of, it blends the conqueror ethos with the individualist ethos, right? And really, when you think about it, that is the alchemy that has produced the American ideology, right? Have you ever seen the film There Will Be
Did you
Blood?
just think of that, or have you known this for a while?
Well, so
The individualist with the conqueror.
I have to again. I do it almost every time we talk. I have to credit Origi for that because he really just
Oh
blew
yeah.
my mind with it. But also, did you see the film There Will
Now,
Be Blood?
give the name of the book and the author.
Oh yeah, that would be the Long 20th Century by Giovanni Arrighi.
Okay.
And Paul Thomas Anderson did the film There Will Be Blood, which was about oil, I believe, by Sinclair maybe.
Hmm.
And it's very similar, but instead of cowboys, it's oilmen,
Mhm.
right? People who build the oil derricks and stuff. And it's a very similar. It's a critique, first of all. It's not an act of revisionism, and pointing out that like the people who very literally built this country as we know it did it because they had the desire to single-handedly grasp everyone and everything around them and force them into submission, right?
But that's not what we're taught.
No, not at all. Not at all. We were taught that this was a noble act, a necessary act, and that look at all the fruits and the bounty of it is our wonderful nation that we've built up to provide all of the great resources like iPhones or whatever the hell.
And this is a product of capitalism. This is a product of individual freedom, we're told.
Precisely, and that is the myth, right? The myth is that all of this was done out of necessity, that all of this was done with this sort of idea that we're building a free and prosperous nation, when in reality, the Cowboys themselves didn't really do that. I think probably a closer representation would be something like Lonesome Dove, just a few cowboys out on the trail who nobody really likes, and they're just trying to make a living. That's probably a lot closer to reality. And the truth is that the real masters behind the whole thing were the capitalists who owned the massive livestock estates,
Right.
the industry in the East.
Let's give another quote from the book. This is about the cowboy myth. Cowboys are wiser, stronger. This is from This Land by Christopher Ketchum. Quoting from the book, it says, "Cowboys are wiser, stronger, faster, better drinkers, better lovers," Lynn Jacobs observed acidly, "and also they are more real, more courageous, and more exciting than other people." If the cologne didn't have the desired effect, the public could get a cowboy steak. This is about using the cowboy myth to market products. If the cologne didn't have the desired effect, the public could get a cowboy steak with ranch-style beans and ranch-flavored potato chips at the Branding Iron, Golden Corral, Rustler's Roost, El Vaquero, or at dismal Arby's with its glowing cowboy hat image. While eating, we could listen to the droning of Congress as it passes year after year National Day of the American Cowboy resolutions to recall for us that the cowboy is an American icon, embodies honesty, integrity, courage, compassion, and is an excellent steward of the land and its creatures. And the idea that the cowboy is an end of quote. And the idea that the cowboy is an excellent steward of the land and its creatures is exactly the myth that is exploded by This Land by Christopher Ketchum.
Yeah, and you know every people, all cultures have to have some sort of myth, right? They have to have some sort of superhero that embodies all of the desirable traits of that nation, right? Like what
Listen, my children, and you shall hear. You can just see no matter what culture it is, they're going to tell stories to the children, and those stories illustrate the cultural ideals.
Exactly. You put it better than I could have. But of course, the problem with that, as we know, is that one, it's a myth. It's literally not real.
Yeah, right.
We learn it as if it is. And then, of course, there's the fact that we get off into these preconceived notions of what these words mean, right? What does it mean to be honest? What does it mean to have integrity, courage, compassion? What does it mean to be a good steward, right? And those are questions that we no longer have to ask because we've already been supplied the answer, right? In the form of this Marlboro man, Like that's what it means to have courage, is to be the Marlboro man going into town with two fists and a revolver, that's courageous. You're an excellent steward by introducing invasive species into a land and over exploiting it. You know,
Christopher Ketchum points out that the Marlboro Man is honest, even though he never says anything. He smokes, but he just doesn't talk, but he's
right,
honest, you know.
right. It is absurd. You have to laugh at it, but it is a real issue. I think when we start getting into, and I think you still see it to this day with a lot of these sort of right wing groups that sort of have this sort of cowboy image, but for the modern day. This sort of two-fisted, hard drinking, hard living. Like I'm a manly man and I work on my farm on my own, right? And that's sort of the image.
Cowboys like smoky old pool rooms and clear mountain mornings.
Right, right.
Little warm puppies and children and girls of the night. Them that don't know him won't love him, and them that do sometimes won't know how to take him. He ain't wrong, he's just different, and his pride won't let him do things to make you think he's right.
I'm not sure what you're quoting, but it gave me the urge to listen to Marty Robbins, which isn't a bad thing. I love Marty Robbins, but
That's mamas don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, well, now I'm going to listen to that song all day. But, point being, again, it's just sort of like presupposing the definition of terms that are really should not be settled. That we really should not have just sort of like allowed that to be the image, that it should not be the way that we all sort of collectively understand these
We've
things.
allowed ourselves to be lied to on a large scale.
Precisely. And
And,
that's
and we have held, minorities have always had hell to pay because of our cultural myths. Native Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans have always had hell to pay because of our cultural myths. But white men have not, what goes around comes around. I wish that were true quicker, but I don't know if there's going to be a reckoning, but I'm a white male with an upper middle class background, and I'm seeing the stuff hit the fan because of these cultural myths. Climate change is the stuff hitting the fan because of these cultural myths. And I was conservative up until a couple of years ago. I was, moderate up until a couple of years ago, conservative most of my life. And now I'm seeing these cultural myths that are really they're putting at risk everything that matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot. I'm glad you mentioned the effect that this has had on people of East Asian descent, people of indigenous descent, people of Latin American descent, people who are African American. Because when you look at this, we're given this image of the cowboy who looks like John Wayne, who looks like Clint Eastwood, who looks like a white guy, and they were the men who built the West. When in reality, it was mostly Chinese immigrants, Mexicans, Native American people who were already there, and people who were either enslaved or were freed into the bondage of sharecropping and itinerant labor in the form of African Americans. And those were the people who very literally, for the most part, built the West.
And let's look at another aspect of building the West, and that is the federal government gave these companies land, gave it to them, gave them way more land than they ever needed, gave it to them. Not a lease, not you can borrow this for a while as long as you use it in the public interest, gave them the land. And that's an externality, isn't it? That's a cost that was shifted onto the public.
That seems like a little kink in the theory, just a small one.
Right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a real problem, and I think that it really has deleterious effects even on the people who buy into the theory and try to emulate that. I was telling you before we came on about my father. He died at age 53, right? And my father was one of the few people who bought into the myth of the cowboy and actually did kind of live it. Like, he did live a pretty solitary existence. He lived off the land for the most part. He made his own money, but there was blood, sweat, and tears. and also quite a bit of wage theft and exploitation. Um, but we don't talk about that.
Right.
But the thing is that, that killed him. He died at 53 because humans can't do that.
Hmm.
You can't do that. That's a myth. Maybe you can do it for a little
Can't
while.
do what?
You can't live a solitary existence doing nothing but work. You can't live by constantly toiling every single day for, 18 hours a day and only sleep, 4 hours a night, because I know he did that.
Hmm.
You can't do that and have a full, fulfilling, long life. But we have been sold that so much that people buy into it. And they either end up like my father and actually live that way successfully and die young, or you spend your whole life wondering what's wrong with you that you can't do that. And that is just a horrific effect on
Oh, yeah.
the psyche. And I think that gets lost in translation.
If you're just joining us, this is Hart Hagen with Let's Talk, and I'm joined by Jake Bush, and we are talking about a book called This Land by Christopher Ketchum. The subtitle of This Land is How Cowboys, Capitalism, and corruption are ruining the American West. And I thought cowboys built the American West. So Christopher Ketchum is telling us how the cowboy myth, how cowboys, literally the ranch owners, are destroying the American West and are doing it at our expense because we as taxpayers not only subsidize we let them use the land with hardly paying anything to use the land. Plus, what was the other thing? Government agencies like the U.S. Forest Service, like the Bureau of Land Management, like Animal Damage Control, like Wildlife, I forget what. Anyway, the different agencies and bureaus that are subsidized by taxpayers. For example, ranchers are always crying that, oh, wolves killed my cow. Wolves keep killing my cow. Well, wolves kill very few cows, and when they do, it's because there's this whole unintended consequence. With wolves, with mountain lions, with grizzly bears, with wild horses. If you kill them, they multiply faster. And also with the mountain lions and the wolves have this this herd dynamic that says when you start killing them, they become more aggressive toward domesticated animals instead of just living on wild animals.
Mm-hmm.
So the science shows that when you kill wolves or horses or mountain lions, they tend to multiply and they tend to be more of a problem to ranchers. But yet the ranchers don't want to know, they have these trade groups that spread all the lies, the propaganda.
And before we even get to that point of the analysis, my
Right.
very first instinct was, well, yeah, you're in their home, dude.
Right.
It's sort of like when people get bit by sharks. It's like, yeah, I mean, the shark kind of lives there. I can't really blame the
Right.
shark for being mad that you're just barging into its front door, basically.
Right.
If you're raising, I mean, like, I don't know, if you're a wolf, it's like, yeah, you're raising my food on my property. Why would I not eat my food? You know what I mean?
So here's what's outrageous about what you just said. If I'm the white American male, here's what's outrageous about that. You're telling me that species should have rights. That's outrageous. If you say rivers should have rights, that's outrageous. If you say mountains should have rights, that's outrageous. If you say the air should have rights, that's outrageous. If you say water should have rights, that's outrageous. Giving rights to anything but human beings is outrageous to me.
Right, because we have sort of like hook, line, sinker bought the capitalist pitch for what matters, right? Which is preserving transactions, preserving the commodity form, right? Because you have to think of these things in terms as commodities. Otherwise,
and even within that framework, if you knew all the facts, you wouldn't let people pollute water and destroy species and all that. But I hear what you're saying, though.
Yeah, it's just this idea that one, you can treat them as externalities, like you were talking about. You can just say, well, the river is an externality. It's outside of, it's I have a boundary of things that I have to care about, and that's outside of it, right? Which is also absurd because it's all connected. Like if you just pollute every river, you can't just go on the rest of your life thinking, well, I'll just raise a crop of soybeans. Like, no, you can't.
Jake, we have to save jobs. We have to create jobs.
Right, right. And this is the only way to do it, isn't it? I mean, there's just no other way. We've never seen a successful way of giving people, meaningful work that is actually useful, other than this form where the individual capitalist buys out a property and
And business owners are job creators. Ranchers are job creators. Ranchers create jobs. Oil companies create jobs.
Right, right. And there's just no other
Sometimes,
way.
quite often, they don't even do that, but that's the rhetoric.
Right. I mean, that's sort of the thing that, I think that you get into this territory where you really have to question, you know, are you being willfully obtuse or you actually don't know what you're talking about? You know what I mean? Like when people use this language, and maybe I'm getting off, but I don't think I'm terribly getting off topic here
No, this is right on.
in just saying that, you really got to question when people hew to this line. You really got to wonder, are you bought or are you stupid? I'm not sure which one, but it's one of them.
And there are only so many choices here.
And there's only so much you can do about that, frankly. Like I often question the utility of arguing with people about things like that when it's just demonstrable.
Let's explore the intersection between bought and stupid. Captain Sinclair said it's hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it. There's the intersection of bought and stupid. You're stupid because you're bought.
Precisely. I was telling you before we got started, my wife started watching this reality show about, high dollar real estate in California, right? And exactly what we're talking about, really. And they're doing it for commercial and residential properties. But point being, you could sit down and explain to them. You could have like a real theorist and a real thinker sit down and explain to them, do you understand that this overdevelopment, all this construction is actually degrading the land that you live on to such a degree that the construction itself will no longer be feasible in the future? You understand that you're literally killing yourself and your industry. And I think on a certain level, I don't think that they could understand that because everything in their life depends on that happening.
Let's bring up that four-letter word, Marx. Didn't he say something to the effect that, he was very complimentary of capitalism in terms of the dynamic nature of how it, harnesses resources, but he also said it's gonna destroy the very foundation. It's going to consume itself. It's going to consume the means. Capitalists are going to consume all their capital. They're going to create financial capital, but in so doing, they're going to destroy social capital and they're going to destroy natural and environmental capital.
Mm-hmm. And they're also going to degrade the labor force that they depend on. And that's the thing is that that was the thing about Marx is that he asserted that all historical forms of economy destroy themselves, really. Feudalism destroyed itself just like capitalism is destroying itself before our very eyes. It contains the seeds of its own destruction. I feel like that's the
right.
quote.
Yeah.
And that's what we're witnessing with this model of accumulation. That when you overexploit the land and you over leverage the land will no longer yield any crops. The land will no longer be usable. And therefore, this very way of doing things is bringing about all the destruction we're seeing on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the way, to tie it back to the cowboy myth, that cowboy myth is just a justification. It's a sort of closed logical loop of saying we're doing this because the Cowboys did it and the Cowboys were good and we need to emulate the Cowboys. Well, the Cowboys did that, therefore this can no longer be bad. You see what I'm saying? It's this sort of like logic that totally breaks down. You really think about it, but we're given this tautology to accept the destruction of the land that we depend on.
The ability to believe all this requires a good education.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, you have to be taught this stuff because it does not make it sense unless you are taught it specifically.
Well, there's something, an issue you raised. Here's a conversation that goes on in environmental circles, even among genuine, real environmentalists. There are a lot of posers out there and fake environmentalists, many of them under the umbrella of Big Green. But let's set them aside for a minute. The question is, do we value ecosystem services? Do you place a value, a dollar value on what ecosystems can do for you? You know, like look at trees. Trees cool the air, trees clean the air, trees filter the water, trees provide habitat for wildlife, trees capture carbon out of the air. You can go on and on about what trees are habitat for pollinators. Pollinators, not only are responsible for many of our food crops, but are also responsible for all the air we breathe. If you consider that pollinators are responsible for the continuing life and viability of plants, and plants are the only things that make oxygen in our world. So do you have all these ecosystems, valuable services? So one school of thought says, let's put a dollar value on those services, and then we can present this to governments and to businesses and say, look at the dollar value of the Amazon forest that you're destroying. Look at the dollar value of the trees that you're destroying as part of real estate development. And then another school of thought, which I think this is Christopher Ketchum. He said, and this is also E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist. He says, the value of these things is intrinsic, and not if we start putting a dollar value on it, then that's the wrong conversation to have.
I agree.
So
I agree, and in some ways I understand, because there are some people who you will never convince of that, and I've had those conversations that you're just never going to convince them that there's an intrinsic value to these things. I agree. I think there is.
But here's another thing. Even on its own terms, the profit motive is like destroying. I don't know about the profit motive, but let's say GDP, gross domestic product, which is a terrible measure of success, even economic success. It's just terrible. Absolutely. But more generally, let's talk about prosperity and human flourishing. If human flourishing is the goal, then we are undermining the very foundation of human flourishing.
Absolutely. And I think that we have this very narrow view of what that means to flourish as a human. It reminds me of
that's another thing that's not subject to a dollar value.
Right, it shouldn't be, and right. I think that we've been so captured by the sort of capitalist mindset that even when people say like, oh, why are you going to college for that degree? There's no jobs with that degree. You'll never get a job. It's like, well, I don't think that we should just be learning just so we can make money.
Right.
Learn because learning is important.
In fact, humanities, as Chris Hedges talks about, humanities is subversive. Yeah. Learning history and learning philosophy and you name it. It's subversive. And it doesn't necessarily have a dollar value, but if the only thing we learn in college is that which has a dollar value, then we're captured by the commercial interests.
Absolutely. And I think that is a really horrifying thing when I really think about it for too long. So here's the thing. I'm always hesitant to have these conversations with you because I'm not an environmentally minded person. I just can't wrap my head around.
Not everybody has to be, but
no, not everybody has to be. And my ultimate, what I always fall back on, and maybe it's just superstitious, is just that if something is that old, right? I think about things like the trees that have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, in biomes that have existed in circuitous harmony for millennia, just don't mess with it.
Yeah,
you
right.
Gotta figure it out. Okay,
right.
You don't and maybe that's again just a superstitious thing that I default to, so I don't have to think about it on a theoretical level. But really, I don't understand why we have to go farther than that. Which is just, look, man, don't mess with this. Nature's got that figured out, and you are not smarter than nature.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how cows out west are ruining nature. So we have this cultural myth that says out west, what's supposed to be there? Well, cows and cowboys are supposed to be out west. So if at the level of public policy, at the level of news and information and commentary, there's this the erroneous association of the West as it should be with cowboys. So, but let's okay, quoting from the book. This is from This Land by Christopher Ketchum. He says, everything, so Christopher Ketchum is from New York and he goes out west and writes this book. He says, everything I thought about cows as an Easterner come west is wrong. They are not symbols of a noble culture of mounted herdsmen. It's talking about cows. They are not cute. They are an invasive species, Bos taurus. A water-loving European animal not fit for arid climates, and their cancer-like effects on the land have not ceased. The fatal error of the proclamation of 1996, this is Clinton administration, acting, anyway, the fatal error of the proclamation of 1996 was that it continued to allow cattle grazing. Of course it will, but go ahead. This was done for political expediency, like what else was Bill Clinton about the political expediency?
Right.
Or
Nothing
whatsoever.
else marked his yeah.
This was done for political expediency to quiet the opposition of cattle interests. There is no way to square that decision with the science of botany. How can you preserve a wild and unspoiled landscape with a ruinous, alien bovine on it? You can't. It's an impossibility, an absurdity. So what he's saying is that the cow and the West mix like oil and water. And how contrary is that to what we have been led to believe?
Yeah, precisely. I don't think that, and this kind of comes back to a lot of the other, myth-making endeavors that this country has embarked upon, which in theory are not really all that different from the myth-making of other cultures. But we very much have tried to naturalize that which is unnatural. We have tried to get it in people's heads that there just is no other way this could ever be, when really this is an invention that is only about 200 years old.
That's the function of propaganda and the function of education, to take the absurd and make it seem normal and natural.
Yeah, exactly. And I grew up on a cattle farm, actually. That's where I was born and raised. There, we had cattle my entire life.
Okay. Important distinction. We are in Kentucky. Now, let me digress just a minute.
No, that's good.
Many people are under the impression that cows are bad ecologically. I disagree. So you have a lot of people who are vegan because you can be vegan for animal rights reasons, or you can be vegan for environmental reasons. If somebody is vegan for animal rights reasons, I respect that. I don't want to bother them. I don't want to argue them out of that position at all. It's a respectable position. But if you're a vegan for environmental reasons, we need to talk. Mm-hmm. And here's if you learn nothing else, I would say Joel Salatin. See what Joel Salatin has to say about how to raise cows in such a way that it's biomimicry. You raise cows in such a way. For one thing, you rotate them on the grass so that and you don't do this out west. Cattle are an invasive species out west, but if you're east of the Mississippi River, if you're in Virginia or Kentucky or Tennessee or Ohio or Indiana, then you can also raise cows unsustainably here, but you can raise cows not only sustainably, but where it's very ecological. Mm-hmm. So the way that works is that, if you let cows graze on grass for a certain period of time, and I'm not talking about our turf grass. Did you know corn is a grass? Grass can be over your head.
Right.
So you let them graze on the grass, and then you move them off of that using electric fences and the like. But you let them graze on the grass, They poop on the grass, thereby fertilizing it. You let the chickens come along after that and do their thing, because birds following cattle is a natural thing. That's biomimicry, when you let birds come along and pick up after cattle. So you fertilize that grass, then you let it grow, and then for a period of time. And then at some point, the cattle come back and graze it again. If you do that, it's ecological in many ways, but it's carbon capture. The carbon is being absorbed out of it, just the way when a tree grows, it absorbs carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it underground. Did you know that the soils of the earth have the capacity to, according to Doug Tallamy, the soils of the earth have the capacity to store 7 times as much carbon as is in the atmosphere? Don't we need that? So I learned that part from Doug Tallamy. Forests can store, that's why we need to let trees grow and let forests grow. But cows are an extra, part of in that the same thing happens with grass. So you let grass grow properly, and then it stores carbon in the roots and in the soil. That's why, soil can be clay or sand or loam. Loam is like Kentucky wants to be a forest. So for eons, Kentucky has had forests. Those trees have served to store the carbon in the soil, making it rich and fertile. That is a natural process. And anyway, I'm just saying that I'm going to badmouth cattle on the range, and I'm going to badmouth cattle in concentrated feeding operations. I'm going to badmouth cattle when it comes to feeding them grains, because it is a historical accident that grain is cheap enough to feed to animals. That is a complete historical accident brought to you by fossil fuels, which we get cheap because of war. I'm going to badmouth all of those ways of raising cattle. But in Kentucky and in Virginia, in Ohio, in Tennessee, probably most of the states east of the Mississippi, you can raise cattle sustainably, and if you do it right, it can be very positive from an ecological standpoint.
Right, but where's the profit motive there, Hart? You're missing something.
Oh, well, that's all that matters.
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, a lot of this stuff is over my head, not my thing, but what I do understand is that nature is a harmonious thing, and capitalism is anything but harmonious. It cannot be harmonious. And that's why, it's very funny. I saw somebody on Twitter have a little exchange. There was like a libertarian or something who said, you think you hate capitalism, you really hate the state. And somebody was like, well, let me tell you something about the capitalist state. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the issue here, is that, you think you hate, cattle, you think you hate beef. Really, you kind of hate capitalism. Because all of these things, if we were going by having a harmonious flow, right, and having a structure that was sustainable, then these things would not be the issue that they are. That's what I'm getting from this. Am I off base? Am I oversimplifying here, Hart?
Oversimplifying what?
Because again, a lot of the ecological stuff I don't totally understand. It just, the details of it are lost on me.
Well, the part about, okay, so let's talk about libertarians and government and business. So libertarians typically say government is the problem. I say the problem is with a government that has been captured by business. That's why Chris Hedges and Ralph Nader call it the corporate state. It is a state that is defined by its control by big money. That's the problem. It's not government. Government is part of a civilized society. Government is necessary to protect the weak from the strong. Government is necessary to protect the poor from the rich. Government is necessary to be a referee in all of our affairs. But it's not like we have a concept of government being distant and remote. Mm-hmm. Government should be a result of collaboration at every level. We should have workplaces that are a result of a democratic collaboration. We should have government at a local level that addresses the true needs of local people, and at the state and the regional level, at the national level, at the international level.
And what I'm seeing here,
When we see government, we're not seeing a functional government. It is extremely dysfunctional if the purpose of government is to promote human flourishing.
and to loop this back into, our topic here, what I'm seeing here, in the quote from Ketchum, the fatal error of the proclamation of 1996 was that it continued to allow cattle grazing. This was done for political expediency to quiet the opposition of cattle interests, right? So what we're seeing here is not so much as that the government is necessarily the problem on an essential level.
Mm-hmm.
What we're seeing is that the problem is that the government is captured by the interests of these big, massive cattle ranches, right? Like I think about like the Bundys. They're a good example of this kind of stuff, where like they're basically just bulldozing the common good in order to assert their dominance in this market, right? And to me, when I try to make sense of this kind of stuff, which again is not my thing, what I kind of come back to is this understanding that the issue is that the big interest, the big, agribusiness, has sort of bulldozed all common good, both in the land sense and in the people sense, and really in a lot of ways the economic sense, in order to dominate their market, right? And that seems to be the major issue.
Yeah.
Right? And okay, well, if it's that simple, then I guess I'll just go put on some Neil Young and be done with it.
Well, I'm sure there was. Okay, what's the thing with Neil Young?
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. No, Neil Young's whole thing for the last few years is that he has this extreme grudge against like Monsanto and big agribusiness. I actually saw him live once. It was fantastic, by the way. And he went off and had this whole monologue about how much he loathes agribusiness, and he wrote like a whole concept album with like a story and I think maybe a novel attached to it about people fighting back against agribusiness and stuff. Very cool.
Okay, here's a curve. I don't know if it's a curveball. Maybe I think it's a little bit maybe unexpected. As a environmentalist who is somewhat knowledgeable and passionate about it, I would say that the single worst industry is. I would like to say the fossil fuel company or the war machine is the single worst industry, but I would have to say agribusiness is even worse.
Yeah,
ecologically and otherwise. It's just there is no industry that is at war with life on Earth more than agribusiness.
And I hope, when I was talking about the cowboy myth, what I really wanted to do was tie in those three things, because they all have an ideological base, and as a materialist, I have to think that they all have a material base, right? That they all have common interests, both in
absolutely.
And propagating this myth of the individual conqueror, you know what I mean? Because all three of those rely on that. This idea that, and it's also twisted up into sort of twisted readings of Christianity, saying that men have providence over the land, that men dominate the land, which is not the point of Christianity, but that's neither here nor there. Point being is that we have been sold this myth that everything that exists around us is there for the taking. That the individual conqueror, through their will and their determination and their cunning, can just reach out and grab it and force it to their will, and that's how we end up with this break in the harmony between people and the land, which is ontologically also broken, because that's assuming there's some sort of distinct difference between people and the environment, that we are not of the same thing, that we don't share the world, that we're not all a part of the same circle, the same cycle, and
if you're just joining us, this is Hart Hagen with Let's Talk, and I'm joined by Jake Bush, and we're talking about This Land, which is a book by Christopher Ketchum, How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West. And Jake, you were just talking, we have about like 3 minutes left. You were just talking about how, humans are part of nature, and we can't dominate and control and exploit and destroy nature for very long, can we?
No, because and again, I don't want to get into this too deep because that would take a long time. But we have this sort of this broken ontology of like what nature is. Like we don't understand what it is, right? Because we separate ourselves from nature, right? That there is man and then there is the flora and the fauna,
Mhm.
right? And those
Mhm.
things are separate,
Mhm.
right? When any workable understanding of that would understand that we are all made of the same stuff, that we are all a part of the same cycle, that we all depend on one another. And really, this is the socialist pitch too. It's also the Buddhist pitch, that we're all connected and there is a certain harmony and a certain flow that must be preserved in order for a sustainable life, and I think the problem is that through the machinations of capitalism and the sort of twisted Christianity that I've referenced, we have started to understand ourselves as the individual human being above everything else, right? And everything else is there for the taking and for exploitation. When, again, any workable
It's
theory
like
of
Margaret Thatcher said, society is a myth. Some people some people say the individual is a myth, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. But certainly, human beings can't be divorced from nature.
No, and I don't think that you should have to take psychedelic drugs to understand that we're all
Mhm.
connected. Everybody
Mhm.
talks about like, oh, I tripped on acid and then I understood that we're all connected. And I'm like, I don't think you should have to take acid to understand that.
Mhm.
That really, we all depend on one another as human beings, but we in as human beings depend on everything else on this earth. That there's a natural order to things. And I think through this
We
act,
are animals.
we are
We
animals
are animals.
and we must coexist with other
Mhm.
animals in a harmonious way, and that doesn't mean that we can't eat animals or farm them or anything like that, but that just means you cannot continue with the agribusiness, with the natural gas industry, with the war machine, the things that completely fray the bonds between beings. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and that's the cowboy myth is at the because the cowboy is he's really independent and individualistic, and yet he feels free to dominate other people. I mean, that's free market capitalism right there. When
Yep.
Boeing or General Dynamics or Halliburton can make all these weapons, and to hell with you if you don't like it.
Yep. Yep. It is the ideological linchpin, and it has been repeated over and over. Every time you see a new truck commercial, it's always somebody with a cowboy hat driving it. Whenever you see a gun, they're usually walking around like a cowboy and swaggering like they're John Wayne because they're showing off their new Sig Sauer, available at a Walmart near you.
Mhm.
And because that is, again, the ideological linchpin is that you, the individual, can dominate everything around you, and you should.
And that's the problem we're going to solve next time when we revisit this land with Christopher Ketchum. Jake, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a wonderful conversation. I can't wait to continue the conversation next time. And so, to our audience, have a great day and come back and join us again soon.
Thanks.